Okay, and I'm live. So if you're on Twitter, I'm going to put the comment, put it in the top comment. If you're on YouTube, just give me a couple minutes. And if you're watching this not live, below, in the little thing, there'll be probably. Okay, so I'm going to react. I'm trying out a bunch of different things basically because I don't know what works, and I put some stuff on YouTube, and that works, and I wasn't expecting it to work, and I put a lot of effort into content, and I don't really know what works, so I'm doing these reactions to kind of get a feel for being on camera more, and people seem to like them. I don't know. I feel like I've been putting out a lot of cheap content recently, but people like it, and more stuff is coming. I'm working on the scripts in the background and everything, but give me a couple minutes while people trickle in. And I'm going to start 5 minutes in. And if you're watching this not live, then yeah, click the thing below. And what I'm going to do here is just there's a lot of these lore videos. So I'm just going to talk about them. I watched a few of them before, and there's lots of things like there's adaptations to the environment that they do, that different species do, like the Ewoks. There's rites of passages that they have. I noticed that especially with the Ewoks. All these things that are in cultural anthropology, and we can look at real cultures, and obviously we do all the time. But there's also something about like learning about your own culture through studying these extreme examples, and of course, these different species are heavily influenced by real cultures in a lot of ways, a lot of situations. Yeah, so I'm going to do that. We're going to start here just a second. And yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm just adding the timestamps right now. That's the word for it, timestamps. Yeah, so analyzing, I have completely lost my mind. I'm analyzing Star Wars species like they're real cultures. But let's do it. Let's start with the Ewoks.
What's up, Meta Nerds? Today we'll be pulling from every resource available from legends and canon to fully understand the Ewok people. Ingenious, artistic, mystical, and deadly, with an insatiable appetite for meat, these are truly one of the most unique species in Star Wars. The story begins at grid coordinates H16 in the Outer Rim, on the forest moon of Endor. This moon had 18-hour days, 402 days in a year, and was relatively small at 4,900 kilometers.
Dude, just think about what would change about human culture just based on the length of the day. Like even those types of things. Those are the types of consideration that it's something that you wouldn't think about in real life. Like you wouldn't think about how the time of day affects it. Although you can find cultures that live in places where the not the weather. Well, the weather, yes, but like extreme climates produce extreme cultures, but also like extreme climates, like frozen up top, they have days of pure darkness and days of pure light and like weeks on end. What's up, JC? Always appreciate that, brother. I hope your pork chops are great. I'm going to take this banner off that I forgot about. Please like the video and let's keep going.
In diameter, less than half the size of Earth, and had only 8% surface water. It's home to 30 million Ewoks, but also an unknown number of several other sentient species. It's rare to have so many intelligent beings develop on a single location.
One of the things I want to do is ask what culture in real life is each species. So what are the Ewoks?
I mean, Endor is home to the Dulok, Ewok, Gorf, Tuzum, and Wisti. Deep dives into each can be their own videos, but we do need to understand them a bit to fully appreciate the world of the Ewoks.
I mean, they're known
Duloks are distant relatives to our small friends, and were tribal warriors, highly aggressive and living mostly in the swamps. Essentially taller, stronger, dumber, and worshippers of the night spirit, an evil deity also recognized in the Ewok pantheon. and said to have come to Endor via a meteorite, with its dragon-like servant Mantigrues carrying out all its devilish wishes. They were one of the greatest threats to Ewoks, but rarely traveled up to the treetop villages. The Gorf were intelligent frog-like people who were relatively harmless and kept to themselves. The Yuzum were not genetic relatives, but did share a lot of their love of music. At some point, these two species must have been in heavy contact with each other, as their languages are so similar that these two can communicate just fine.
That like wouldn't work in real life. Like it would, there would be other markers in the language and linguistic anthropology of like, and just linguistics in general. In linguistics, like the language, if it merged somehow, which isn't really a thing. I mean, there are pidgin languages, and they can develop into full languages. So I guess there is merging, but it's usually like the base of one language and then other words get added in. But it's lore, so it's not real.
Over time, they must have diverged, possibly in some great war lost to history, as they do eat walklings, baby Ewoks.
That's crazy.
And some worship a being called Morag, an alien witch that saw the joy of the Ewoks as an impediment to her dark side-powered magic.
Yeah, and
but by far the most magical were...
That's the thing. A lot of religions, a lot of belief systems have things built into them that dehumanize and promote violence or taking away from other people. Even something like the Comanche.
The Wisties, also called fire sprites or fire folk, they were enigmatic fairy-like beings, guardians of the forests, and by extension came to have good relations with the Ewoks. Their biology is one of the strangest on any world, beating even the telepathic shard species, as they appear to be completely plasma and able to set objects and enemies on fire. Understanding all that, let's look closer at their world. These little sentient humanoids stand at around 1 meter tall, making them about equal to a Jawa and less than half the height of a Wookiee. Some folks even playfully dub them mini Wookiees due to their size. They carry a solid weight of about 50 kilograms, or about 110 pounds, which is surprisingly dense for their compact frame. Little feisty, pint-sized wrestlers brimming with strength. As they grow, Ewoks follow a slightly accelerated maturation timeline compared to humans. Childhood ends at 9, adulthood kicks in at 14, they hit middle-aged at 30, and by 45 they're considered old. Venerable Ewoks keep on rocking well into their 60s. Ewoks are covered in fur from head to toe, showcasing various shades of brown and black, while most flaunt solid color.
I wonder if there's racist Ewoks. Like there's like a preferred color. It seems completely random because they're like a mixed society of different colors. But yeah, Ewok racism, so cute.
Colored fur. A few stand out with stylish stripes. There are even those rare ones with a nearly white or reddish fur, with pure red being the ultimate rarity in the Ewok world. And surprisingly, there is no record of this, but you'd imagine some people would love to get their hands on these hides. I can imagine an underworld manager strutting around.
That's what capitalism does. Just like, yeah, let's find the hides and sell them.
Around in a full Ewok suit.
It's just something y'all ain't know I knew. They used to run fast.
Now their eyes were big and bright, their noses small and human-like, accompanied by an exceptional sense of smell. Those two-fingered hands topped with a nifty opposable thumb may seem diminutive, but don't let that fool you. Ewoks pack a punch, as they're actually strong enough to outmuscle trained human fighters. Furry friends are omnivores at heart, yet their main calorie source leans heavily on meat, enjoying the forest buffet with no reservations, munching on just about any critter that crosses their path, even humans.
Letting the Ewoks...
I mean, they're just like little trash pandas. They don't look like trash pandas, but they're just human garbage disposal.
Cook the enemy?
Who am I to interfere?
We must treat the enemy fairly.
They cleverly use their armor like a culinary cocoon, boiling up meats inside their plastoid shell until it's all fall off the bone tender. And who could forget the classic joy of a good old grilling session? The forest floor beckons them to hunt, armed with stone-tipped arrows and spears. Their prowess was legendary, and they prided themselves as skilled hunters. A single Ewok could skillfully ensnare smaller creatures, yet when a hunting party assembled, their deadliness...
Dude, like, there's no draw on that bow, but whatever.
...reached new heights. Boar wolves, towering in size, met their match in Ewok tactics. Devising a cunning plan, the Ewoks lured these mighty beasts with scraps of bloodied meat from previous endeavors. Then, a net of vines was poised on the forest floor. As the beast lunged for the bait, it became entangled. From the shadows emerged Ewok warriors, charging with spears and poison darts. A single boar wolf yielded meat to sustain a village for days, a testament to their resourceful approach. For smaller game, Ewoks wielded sling nets with precision, A clever loop would trigger a pressure trap, launching the creature into a tree with a pinned sapling's release. In their defense against colossal aptly urged as other alien palate squeezed for their juice, they transformed into a brew with bitter notes. And while Ewoks were fine with eating other beings, they're not immune to being on the menu themselves.
Dude, that's crazy.
Other alien palates enjoy
Is there not rules against eating sentient species?
Their unique flavor too. During the Clone Wars, the diner Power Sliders and Abathar even dished out Ewok jerky for those daring enough to try it. Looking into their tribes, we see that a council of elders reigns over each village, with the chief at the helm. Within each village, you'll find a mystic medicine man, guarding ancient secrets and tending to the wounded with skilled hands. While the warriors from various tribes decked out in tattered headpieces, each a badge of their unique group. Their attire tells us.
So this is the thing. This is like a thing in different cultures. They have like specific markers, specific maybe types of marking their body, maybe types of piercings. It would change even throughout like a single area of like one tribe, or usually a tribe, not as low as a band, which would be like a smaller division.
Story. Wooden chest shields, jawbones of pint-sized creatures, and fierce teeth, all proudly displayed. But that's not all, for these warriors are artisans of adornment. Feathers, necklaces, and pendants all come together in a symphony of trinkets, transforming their bodies into walking treasure troves. Now keep an eye out for the notable figures among the Ewok tribes, carrying totems that speak volumes about their status. The head warrior stands tall in a feathered crown known as the White Wings of Hope, a symbol of strength and inspiration. Meanwhile, the firstborn of the tribal leader's lineage dons the Red Wings of Courage, showcasing their noble spirit. As for the second son, the Blue Wings of Strength grace their head, a testament to their fortitude. Turning to look at the intricate world of Ewok romance, where single males tread the path of solitude within the lush forest. Crafting their own cozy huts near the bustling Tree City, they offer a helping hand when needed. But what adds a touch of magic to this tale are the unmarried.
Dude, so that's crazy. Like the single males are down here.
Females, secret admirers who grace the doorstep of solitary males with offerings, be it food, attire, and even weaponry. These heartfelt tokens speak of their affection, yearning for the return of these lost souls to embrace the warmth of companionship and family life. When the Ewok decides to take a mate, he embarks on a journey of love and commitment. A special family hut nestled within the Tree City.
And see, this is a specific rite of passage or a ceremony in someone's life, because when you have something public like a marriage and you're deciding to like change, like you do, a lot of times people they move into a new home together. And it's very interesting there's some examples. I don't remember any specific examples right now, but there are situations where single men would be in a different situation than married ones and living sort of outside. And maybe in a group together. In this case, no, but like obviously like the fabled Corios, that's how it would be. No, but I like that. You know, it's like there's a clear distinction between these two lines, and there's a symbolic adoption of new ways of life.
Comes their shared haven.
Symbolic and
as the hut takes shape, it serves as a beacon for his intentions, that he's ready to join in partnership, which is a behavior seen in some bird species. Here's where the tale takes a charming turn. All the unmarried females in the village strive to capture his heart, judging the man on his personality, but also his craftsmanship, until the very last moment. As his dwelling reaches completion, the male keeps his heart open, undecided on his
Wait, it's like an episode of The Bachelor, and he's just like building a hut, trying to attract a mate. This is crazy. I want to do it though. I want to build a house, attract the best woman I can.
Chosen companion. And when the moment arrives, the chosen female holds a unique power, the freedom to accept or decline both the male and this home that he's crafted with care. It's a dance of emotion, a celebration of choice, and a testament to the importance of mutual consent in Ewok unions, and also how much emphasis these people put on woodcraft. We don't know how many months this would take, but the next occupant of this hut would be the adorable Woklings. These fuzz-covered youngsters held a special place in Ewok hearts, their arrival turning the entire village into a chorus of adoration. From the moment they came into the world, attention flowed toward them like a gentle stream. Such was the depth of their care that looking after these little bundles was a shared duty, woven into the very fabric of their community. Woklings, though small, were mighty in their significance. While they might not have wielded many rights or the ability to feed themselves, they carried the weight of traditions and stories, soaking in the wisdom of rituals and legends that would be their guiding stars through life's journey. A tapestry of tales awaited them, offering moral compasses for the twists and turns promised by the life ahead. But the most thrilling moment awaited them as they reached the cusp of adulthood. The Festival of Hoods, a celebration like no other, marked this
so this is a huge textbook rite of passage.
Transition from Walkling to full-fledged Ewok. An enchanted festival where the air is filled with anticipation, where the rustling of leaves seem to carry whispers of destiny. With every heartbeat, the Walklings embrace their metamorphosis, ready to don their hoods and step into the next chapter of their lives. And in this unique society, each stage of life was a chapter. A journey marked by unity, tradition, but also the embrace of change. From cuddles with Walklings to the festivals of hoods, and then the violence of the hunt, their culture allowed them to grow as strong and interconnected as the forest itself. Pause to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. BetterHelp is the world's largest whose custom branches in many ways are similar to Wookiees, with some notable differences. Nestled between the closely spaced trees, these villages were like jewels hidden in the foliage. In the heart of these tree havens was the central village, a cluster of thatched roof huts perched on the main limbs. These elevated abodes stood tall, out of the reach of lurking predators. Bridges dangled like threads of connection, weaving distant huts together, while knotted rope ladders offered pathways both up and down. In the realm of tree cities, tradition reigned supreme. The elders' wisdom manifested in the grandest huts, embracing the very trunks of towering trees. The chief, a central figure, presided over these dwellings, with wide open spaces within these huts hosting a myriad of village activities, from gatherings, meetings, council fires, and mesmerizing storytelling rituals. Dotted throughout the village, family groups carved out their own havens on the outlying trees. Unmarried females, elders, and guests each found their designated sanctuaries within separate huts. Then a sealed structure, reaching higher than the rest, stood as the guardian of the community's sustenance.
What real-life culture do you think these Ewoks are like? I'm trying to figure this out.
Protecting their precious food stores. Yet there were those Ewoks that chose the nomadic path, giving up the comfort of the village for a life of wandering. Traditionalists playfully dubbed them Jindas, a nod to the nomadic Jindas tribe from Endor. Among these vibrant narratives, one village stood out, Bright Tree Village, the dwelling of Chief Chirpa's tribe, a masterpiece of Ewok architecture that offered a glimpse into the timeless rhythm of their forest life. Among the Bright Tree Village tribe, a few Ewoks once sought solitude in the scattered huts on the forest floor. The menace of the Sannyasin marauders nudged them back into the embrace of the trees, realizing the safety of elevated homes was their shield against attacks. Though water could do the trick too. Ewoks were versatile architects, also crafting abodes on tranquil lake shores. These villages were perched gracefully on stilts above the water's surface, with the water proving a natural barrier, safeguarding these lake dwellers from larger predators. Here, wicker traps automated the fishing process, luring in the catch of the
and how they, that's going to affect their culture, where they're living, these freaking beaver people, Ewoks.
The day. And while the elders toiled, harvesting marsh grasses and drying them under the sun's warm gaze, the youth reveled in the water's embrace, unearthing buried treasures of shellfish. Ewok ingenuity didn't stop there, it extended to the rock faces beside cascading waterfalls. Here, tribes found their niche, elaborate water wheels turned like symphonies, driven by the waterfall's force. These spinning giants set in motion wooden gears that powered grindstones, directed conveyor belts across the village, and gracefully transported wooden elevator platforms that were constantly ascending and descending the cliff's heights. From treetops to lake shores and cascading falls, every dwelling was a testament to their resourcefulness, connecting their lives with the rhythms of nature. Now that we know how they lived, if you wanted to visit, we should try to learn the language. Ewokese was the language that danced on their tongues.
What?
If you wanted to visit, we should try to learn the language.
I was about to.
Ewokese was the language that.
That just looks like. I mean, what does that look like to you guys? You see what I'm circling right here? And what's that? That's a Celtic cross. And that's, I mean, you know what that is. That's weird. Could be a couple of different things. Yeah, somebody was having a laugh doing this, dude. This one's like square balls. Okay. Sick. We're gonna do another one because I'm tired of that.
This video is about one of the most disturbing creatures in the lower levels of Coruscant, the Cathan. Though they may not be as deadly or visually terrifying as the Dowsen, their story is much more disturbing. The Cathan.
This is about the lower levels of Coruscant, which is like a really poor area, which I guess they devolve.
Khans were once humans who lived in the upper levels of Coruscant before they were banished to the lower levels where they dwelled in darkness for thousands of generations. These levels were so deep and decrepit that even artificial light was not to be found. This was absolute darkness that eventually led to the loss of their eyes, an extension of the ears and widening of the nose, along with their skin becoming this dull gray color. Many believe that
Like
they
a
were
metaphor
criminals
for
released in
people or
mass,
something.
perhaps intended to starve to death, dumped in some of the lowest levels that were thought to be uninhabitable. People have noticed the poetic justice in this, being that criminals like thieves and spice dealers hope to do better off than their fellow Coruscanti by working less, and now they are forced to live off of the trash produced by that society, and now have the toughest lives of any humans on the planet. Biologists aren't exactly sure what connection they have to the corridor ghouls, these dog-like creatures that seem to have undergone a similar transformation to the Chthon. They still had a grasp of technology, and would seek out electroshock nets, most likely by attacking Coruscant guards and underworld police.
Gosh.
This weapon was effective at collecting whole groups of lost Coruscanti
gnarly.
and off-world visitors, as the electroshock would cause one to black out, and it could even diffuse a lightsaber blade's energy into a harmless shower of sparks. This is how the Jedi Padawan Darsha Asant was captured. She was lucky to survive, as the Chthon were so desperate to find food that they often resorted to cannibalism. In the year 19 BBY, Operation Nightfall was Palpatine's plan to mop up remaining Jedi, and this brought Vader into a fight with the Chthon and Shah Kun.
It's just like a metaphor for Australia or something.
The niece of Plo Koon had survived the purge and was held up in the lower levels. She was able to control the Chthon's simple minds and use them to launch an attack on Darth Vader.
That's
The
awesome.
electroshock nets nearly short-circuited the Sith's life control systems, and was able to hold up to his lightsaber, but a blast of force energy sent these creatures flying to their death. Shah tried to engage him in a lightsaber duel, but though she was easily cut down by Vader, the Chthon would go on to terrorize Coruscant's lower levels for years to come. How many beings are killed by these creatures each year is still unknown.
This is what
So that's
happens
it for
when
their
you let the
history,
government be
but
in
you definitely
charge.
want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. There are some different forms of Chthon seen in the Old Republic, but it doesn't really match the descriptions of it
Dude,
from
it's
the books
ugly
that
as
introduced
shit,
them.
man.
These books do match up with the comic I showed, so I went with that more coherent depiction. The
Alright, what
Chthon
real
seen
life
in the
culture are
game
these
do
guys?
behave like the Chthon should, but were designed to be an analog to the Rak Ghoul. The Flesh Raiders were mutated lower caste members of the
Am I allowed
Rakata,
to
and
be
they would
racist
use the
like that?
Chthons as
Is that
slaves.
abstract?
You can really see that this version of a Chthon doesn't look like it was developed from humans,
Can I say
but with
that?
these eyes, it looks more like a disfigured Rakata. You can imagine a way to explain this being that the human criminal origins on Coruscant was just a myth to scare Coruscanti children into not getting in trouble, and that the Chthon were actually Rakata mutants. But which story and look do you prefer? Let me know in the comments down below. They were first named in the novel Darth Maul Shadowhunter, but first introduced in the illustrated Star Wars Universe book in 1995.
Okay.
And the comic video is all about the Quarran species.
Okay.
These were an aquatic species native to the planet Dak, also referred to as Mon Cala, the name used by their neighbors, the Mon Calamari.
On
Their skin was described as being thick and leathery, while their heads are incredibly unique, with every Quarran having these bright blue eyes, two protruding fang-like teeth, which flanked a long, thin tongue, while each of these tentacles were prehensile, allowing the Quarran to manipulate food and bring it into its mouth. These seemingly gill-like structures are actually the Quarran's ears, with these holes on the side of the neck being what they breathe through, with what must have been a gill-like structure most likely located in these large sacs
some people
that hung off the back of their
Southeast
head.
Asia.
It is a mystery
spend
to
a lot of time in the
Coruscanti
water.
biologists just how the Quarran developed the ability to breathe in
have to say
air
it.
just as easily as they can
Stay
breathe
14.
underwater, with some theories stating that the Quarran must have once dwelled on land, and that their breathing organs are just adaptations of lungs, while others think that their gill structure simply is able to pull oxygen out of the air as easily as it pulls it out of the water. Important for both theories is to realize that gills in fish and squid found on Earth technically could pull oxygen out of the air. That isn't the problem. They just suffocate out of water because air isn't dense enough to flow through these gills and keep them open so that there is enough surface area for this extraction process to occur. There were 3 different types of Quarran hands, and many believe this isn't enough to call them a subspecies, though this was the qualifications for the 3 different types of Aqualish. Some Quarran have 3 fingers that end in suction cups, while others just end in nubs like a human,
Yo.
and the third type end in these sharp tips, earning the name the clawed Quarran. Although the University of
creative.
Coruscant may be holding out on a decision, I think these should be considered a separate subspecies, as it isn't like these are rare mutations, but actual heritable traits that result in different structures, not like some superficial difference in skin, hair, or eye color. The Quarran would usually prefer to swim around at depths of 300 meters or greater,
That's
and
the
when they
niche.
did want to come to the surface, they did have to worry about a symptom similar to the bends.
Ugh,
People get the bends or decompression sickness when going,
yeah.
and though their breathing organs may be different, even fish have to worry about this at great depths. Fish venting is something that fishermen use to stop the bloating that occurs in the fish version of the bends. So similarly, the Quarran had to time their ascent to the surface of Dak. Quarran temperament on average was very self-centered and revering of tradition, combined with an unhealthy dose of xenophobia. While the average lifespan of a Quarran was 79 years, just beating out Americans, but doesn't come near that of a Wookiee or a
Yeah.
Hutt. In their ancient
Oh my
times,
God,
the Quarran
Wookiees lived
shared the
400
seas with
years.
the Whalodons, Mawapa, and the Knowledge Bank, which led to the formation of the Kokad, which literally translated to one who battles monsters. Though they were technologically inferior to the Mon Calamari, they had been mining the minerals of the seafloor for thousands of years before the two species met.
Wow.
First
that's
contact
weird.
between these two was in the year 4500 BBY, about 500 years before the Great Sith War, and the actions of both parties would establish prejudices that would never disappear.
Fantastic.
The Mon Calamari were primarily living on land, but
We got
spent most of
fish
their time foraging
and
in the water,
raisins.
which made the Quarran leaders fear that this civilization would eventually end up in the deeper Quarran waters,
That's what happened.
so they launched a preemptive attack. They would
Yeah,
ambush
so the cool thing about Hutts is that Hutts basically just are super rich because of compound interest. Like that's like their whole thing. Maybe I don't have one queued up on the Hutts, but I should grab one.
the Mon Calamari, exploding up out of the water and slaughtering them on the shores. The Mon Calamari were shocked and not prone to violence, but they were able to rally a martial spirit and use their superior technology to help put it.
Yeah, hey, what race or culture do you guys think the Hutts are? What would you call the Hutts? What would their be? You know what? Don't answer that. Actually,
Into
get
these
that out of the comment
invasions.
section.
Though the Quarran species took pride in their fierce warriors, this unforeseen technological advantage confused their leaders, and to add extra insult to their pride was their unconditional surrender, as they knew the Mon Calamari were not exaggerating when they said they only ended the war out of fear of making the Quarran go extinct. The Calamari knew that to prevent further
I don't know,
wars,
JC.
they needed to civilize
know.
these Quarran barbarians. During the fighting, hundreds of Quarran children had been captured and placed in reconditioning schools to teach them of art, science, and philosophy, with a cultural outlook that embraced pacifism. When the
Yeah,
war
that's a
ended,
bad idea.
these students were given back to the Quarran, where they inadvertently worked to subvert the culture. They did not feel brainwashed, and their logic was good, but the Elder Quarran pushed
Wait, let's go back. Okay, I mean, look, guys, this is really nice.
civilize these Quarran barbarians. During the fighting, hundreds of Quarran children had been captured
That's why
and
we're
placed in reconditioning schools to teach them
here. Okay, so
as they, and to add extra insult to their pride was their unconditional surrender, as they knew the Mon Calamari were not exaggerating when they said they only ended the war out of fear of making the Quarran go extinct. The Calamari knew that to prevent further wars, they needed to civilize these Quarran barbarians. During the fighting, hundreds of Quarran children had been captured and placed in reconditioning schools to teach them of
okay.
art, science, and
So the Quarran
philosophy,
were like,
with a
okay.
cultural outlook that embraced pacifism.
Okay,
When the
so they basically okay, so this is the thing that happens a lot, right? So the Corran are like the bad species, and they basically civilize them, and they did civilizing them is often, I mean, really all it ever means is that it's of the culture that decides what civilized means. Like the Chinese thought they were civilized, they thought the British were barbarians. The British thought that they were civilized. I don't know if they thought the Chinese were barbarians, but close enough. And this is interesting because they have the kids, they have the culture, they bring the culture back. They're just taught in the Mon Calamari culture. It's just what it is. It happens to subvert the other culture just because people like the ideas and they adopt it.
War ended, these students were given back to the Quarran, where they inadvertently worked to subvert the culture.
This is basically like what happened during Reconstruction. This is like textbook. It's what happened in Germany after World War II. It's what happens everywhere. People in power control the education, and they decide what gets taught. And it's always ideologically based. It's by definition ideologically based.
Sure, they did not feel brainwashed, and their logic was good. But the Elder Quarran pushed back against the Cultural Revolution, insisting that this is a Mon Calamari plot. Time takes its toll on all, however, and as the last of the war-minded Quarran died off, their culture had been changed in about a single generation. This peace lasted for several hundred years.
The thing is, though, that cultures change. I mean, they do change regardless. They change based on outside human impacts. They change based on other factors, environmental factors. They change based on a bunch of things.
Years, marking a time of unprecedented Quarran mobility, with many going off-world and getting jobs throughout the territories governed by the Galactic Empire. Dak had already been offered into the Galactic Republic by the Mon Calamari, who embraced the spacefaring aliens and eagerly integrated themselves into the galactic community. Now with so many Quarrans spread across the stars, we see them involved in everything from accounting to crime syndicates, fighting with Jedi in the Army of Light, and with Sith in the Brotherhood of Darkness. All this time, violence between Mon Calamari and Quarran was nearly non-existent, but that would change because of an outsider, a human named Hugo Barton. He worked for an Outer Rim mining company and recruited hundreds of poor laborers from Dak to come join him in a colonization of the seas of...
So now there's a new thing. So not only what happens in colonizing wars, and I'm using like the Northeast Native Americans for this, like New England Native Americans, people come and they change the environment with colonization as well. This is part of colonization, settler colonization, is that the English came with animals. They came with domesticated animals. And the Northeastern Native Americans, they hunted, and they also they had horticulture. And the animals both screwed with their hunting and screwed with their crops. And this harmed their way of life, essentially. And so there becomes a point where somebody's got to win, because there's a fight between them, and they're mutually exclusive with which can exist. And the Northeastern Native Americans were affecting their environment. They were creating certain areas, but I digress.
Lamared. These desperate Quarran and Mon Calamari were promised as much property as they could claim on this new frontier, but things quickly changed when they landed. Hugo Barton ignored the agreement, denied them access to areas outside the mining operation, and made them all live in cramped quarters, where old prejudices bubbled up to the surface. Though their anger truly lay with the human, their inability to hurt him or his enforcers turned the violence on each other, with these camps essentially erupting into race wars. This spawned the separate Quarran camps, the Shoals, which would remain long after Hugo and his mining overlords. About 500 years later, the representation of Dak in the Galactic Senate was split between the Quarran and Mon Calamari, though Senator TK's would start another rift among these species. TK's was allowing Thalassian slavers to work in the Calamari sector, resulting in the capture of many Mon Calamari. This plot was uncovered, and though he was only placed on house arrest, the senator decided that he would throw in with the Confederacy of Independent Systems.
Smart.
Nearly all of the Mon Calamari were against this, and even a good number of Quarran opposed him, but he appealed to the old culture and formed the Quarran Isolation League. The CIS were eager to capture Dak, and sent plenty of reinforcements to help their new Quarran allies. The first series of skirmishes brought the death of countless numbers of each species, with the Republic sending reinforcements in the form of scuba troopers, led by Kit Fisto.
Hell yeah, man.
On the political side, the Senate had to fill the role of TK's, and found a pro-Republic Quarran senator in the form of Tundra Daumia. Though defeated at the First Battle of Mon Calamari, the separatist Quarran formed the Free Dak Volunteers Engineering Corps, a propagandized name, but which produced some of the Confederacy's most useful ships, like the Providence class and Requisite class. Because members of their species were so essential to the CIS war effort, the first of the human supremacist movements started to grow, with the Commission for the Protection of the Republic declaring that Quarrans could not be trusted, any one of them could be a spy, and they needed to be immediately deported from Coruscant. In
Hmm.
the year 21 BBY, Riff Tamsin brought Aquadroid.
Yeah, so what happens is that, a specific identity or ethnicity gets tied in with a specific, political idea, and that political idea is then considered subversive, and then animosities grow. And this isn't a problem between or within a country when everybody's different competing identities, which within larger identities, like state, racial, ethnic, religious, within the larger country in the United States, for example, then then it's fine if everybody's interests are aligned. But once your interests start being not aligned, it's whatever. And I'm not saying, like, I'm not excusing racism or whatever. I think everybody is an individual, and that's ultimately how we should treat it. But that's why this happens.
And
In my
Trident
opinion.
class assault ships to try and help the Quarrans take this planet from the Mon Calamari. But this was really all just a part of Count Dooku's plan to use the Quarran to wipe out their fishy rivals before casting the Quarran aside as well. The Republic realized how serious this threat was and deployed clones, Jedi, and even the aquatic allies in the Gungan Grand Army. Once Tamsin's plot to take the world from the Quarrans was exposed, their leader Nasor Rai decided to help Prince Lee Char, and their combined forces were able to drive the CIS off-world. Mon Cala would remain free, and remained allied with the Republic for the remainder of the Clone Wars, though this allegiance would not be respected by the Empire. These aquatic species were an easy target for Palpatine's wrath, as not only did the human-centric policies allow for the media to overlook the subjugation of the Mon Calamari and Quarran.
That's what happens. Like, sometimes somebody loses, and if you're going to be the people that loses, then you gotta fight for yourself. You gotta be honest about the situation.
But their senators had been amongst those that signed the Petition of 2000, which was one of the last attempts to try and rein in the Supreme Chancellor's power. Seeing that the Empire was forming in orbit, some Quarran decided that if they sold out the Mon Calamari, the humans would treat them well, so they actually sabotaged the planetary shield.
Ugh.
Duped by foreign powers again, the Empire quickly subdued Dak and took both species as slaves. The Empire wanted the fish folk to fear ever thinking about resisting, so they leveled 3 major cities. Ironically, it would be the Quarran that originally let down the shields, Segor-Tels, that joined forces with the Mon Calamari resistance, and through their combined efforts, they were able to make this.
Yeah, and when you create a situation where when you create a situation geopolitically where people's interests align, then they'll usually work together. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The thing is that this is often contextual, and it happens until the situation changes. A perfect example of this would be in China. The nationalists and the communists, they kind of stopped fighting each other for a few years to concentrate on the Japanese. Once that threat was over, the Japanese are defeated. The Chinese nationalists are fighting the communists again because it's removed. It's always contextual. The relationships are always contextual, and that's why people shift over time. Groups shift over time with their alliances.
Watery world too much of a hassle, and the Empire just left them alone in the Outer Rim. Though the Mon Calamari would go on to play a major role in the Rebel Alliance, the Quarran went back to their isolationist ways, with many choosing to form smaller settlements on the many other water-covered planets, fearing that Dak was doomed to be a part of the destruction that came with being involved with the rest of the galaxy. The few that did stick around regretted it after the reborn Palpatine's attack devastated this world in ways even worse than under the Empire. During the Yuzon Vong invasion, Quarran Senator Poe tried to sell everyone out, and later under the rule of Darth Krayt, nearly the entire population of Dak was killed when the Quarran Darth Azard followed orders to poison the water. And the final insult on record was when the Mon Calamari and Quarran that had left their homeworld generations before were drawn back due to promises of Dak being renewed, and all those that fell for it were quickly enslaved.
Damn.
But to end on a happy note, the Mon Calamari space station that encircled Dak was flooded with water and inhabited by both species peacefully.
Yes.
So that's it for their history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff.
Okay.
Some of you will.
Let's do the huts then, I guess. Or the The Hutts.
Videos all about the biology, culture, and history of the Hutts at this point in the new canon. Originating from the planet Nal Hutta in the Outer Rim territories, they evolved to survive in a hot, swampy environment. The world was so gross that its rain is described as greasy, with water drops being coated in an unknown oily substance. Nal Hutta's most developed city was Barbosa, which was a dark, criminal-infested port town that mirrored the morality of many Hutts. This is also the site of the Grand Hutt Council, which was the ruling body of their galaxy-spanning criminal empire.
True.
By looking at the members of this
Both
council,
of them not my
you can
favorite.
see that the overall
gotta
size
try
of a
stuff.
hut remains
I
relatively
don't think this
constant.
works.
But of course, there are a
It's
few
the
huts
Star
that
Wars.
reach an enormous size, even for this species. They also come in a wide range of colors, with green being the most common,
Go through a
followed
few
by
more,
black
but-
and brown, but many are spotted
if all
in
his
blues,
is good?
yellows, or purples. The most rare were the albino huts,
Gotta do
which
some
had a bright
articles,
white
too.
color due to a genetic defect, and other huts would also modify their colors through the use of tattoos, like we see with Zero. Many huts also use some tattoos to rep their family, and by extension their particular criminal influence.
Okay.
Each of the Hutt clans was divided into families called Khajiitics, and by looking at Jabba's arm, you can see his Dacilligic Khajiitic sigil. A newborn Hutt was about half a meter long, eventually growing to be around 4 meters, and added hundreds of pounds over a lifespan that would stretch out across many centuries, if not millennia. Though they appear to be massive slugs, Hutts actually do have a spine that runs the length of their tail up to their skull, so a more accurate comparison would be to snakes. It is often unwise to generalize about an entire species of sentient creatures, but Hutts are remarkably uniform in their gluttonous lifestyles and love of violence. The only inklings of a religion come from a single Hutt that was said to have risen to the status of a god. His name was Bunta Hestilik Shadru, and that is all that is known of him in canon, but his legend's history has him receive this god status, not through some great wisdom, but because of his victory over his enemies. But to be fair, the Hutts did develop a unique architectural style, seen most notably in their impressive palaces. And though Huttese is a very well-developed language, perfectly capable of producing novels, plays, and poems, it is certainly not one of the galaxy's romance languages. Take this Huttese broadcast of one of the most romantic moments in galactic history.
Uma Jumuna, Uma Yachinicho.
Sadly for other species, their intense clan rivalries and ruthlessness pushed generation after generation of Hutts to dedicate their lives to conquering others. Many underestimated the strength and determination of a young adult Hutt who had not yet gained his own palace and servants. The slobbish reputation of those like Jabba made many believe that Hutts were impotent, drooling fools, but those arms were capable of holding weapons,
Oh my
and their
gosh.
mass could
I've
crush
never
most
seen
other
that.
forms of life. This perfect storm of culture and biology pushed these young conquerors further and further out from Nal Hutta, until they eventually carved out an area
They
known
live
as
forever.
Hutt
I don't
Space.
understand.
Supporting the spice trade across the galaxy, these Hutt clans were able to grow their power over millennia, and enslaved whole populations of Twi'leks and Nikto. During the Clone Wars, the Hutts remained independent for some time, before entering into an informal agreement with the Republic, which allowed them to pass through Hutt space. Tensions
A lot of criminals are government sanctioned, guys. I mean, they let the mob operate. They work with the mob. There's stories about them working with the mob. It's like open. Like they did it for the invasion of Sicily, which, whatever. I guess good on you. It was a good move, but you still worked with organized crime.
always existed in this relationship,
Still
though,
have a
as the cartels were
reciprocal
perfectly fine with
relationship with
making
them.
profits by assisting the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Let alone the fact that almost every aspect of Hutt culture went against Jedi and Republic virtues. But the Empire decided to use the Hutts as allies, letting the repulsive aliens do the dirty work that was unfit for Imperials.
Hell yeah, bro.
Palpatine felt it was best to leave the Hutts in control of their crime-infested territories, instead of wasting resources trying to eliminate them, which would have most likely just ended up in spreading the filth across the galaxy. By using Hutt space, Imperial agents could recruit the criminals they wanted to moonlight for them, while also hiring Hutt enforcers to run several black site prisons. The Hutt's influence was still able to oppress the governments of the Nikto, and keep alive a thriving Twi'lek slave trade. It isn't until the Empire fell, and the galaxy was
Cool,
swept
bro.
up in a wave of freedom movements, that the Hutt's control started to slip. The New Republic was being led by many people who had personally suffered at the hands of Hutts, so they did not set up any kind of agreements with the cartels. The NR essentially waged a war on the cartels, almost completely removing the Hutt's influence. But as is usually the case, This void was filled by other criminals who were eager to have the power they once saw wielded by the Hutts. Ironically, or perhaps not, it would be the Nikto who would become the new species intimately connected with crime cartels, with the most notable organization being Rin Riven Ties. This would mark an end of a criminal era that lasted thousands of years, but we can only wonder if the future will see a revenge of the Hutts. So that's it for their canon story, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff.
I don't think I
The
do.
original concept art for Jabba was abandoned,
To the
but later
Neimodians. These are the new Gunray guys. I mean, just based on the accents alone, what do you think they are? Oh, why is it not? Sorry.
Stunted slime.
I am uncle. Color uncommon.
The blockade is finished.
I
We
don't
dare
know.
not go against the Jedi.
Maybe a little bit.
I
There
don't
might be
want
some
this
influence there,
stunted
but
slime in my sight again.
pretty all over.
What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to pull from all the legends and canon sources out there to understand the Neimodian species, from their biology, culture, history, and impact on the galaxy.
You guys are weird.
The story begins at
Videos
grid
are
coordinates M10 in the
What I
colonies region, on the planet Neimodia. Their homeworld was the third rock from the sun, in a star system that had 4 planets, with a total of 25 moons. Their celestial neighbors ranged from molten rock, a toxic wasteland, and an extremely mineral-rich asteroid belt named Saak-Suan, which was between them and the gas giant. Neimodia was a terrestrial world with a Class 1 atmosphere breathable to most species, close in size to Coruscant at 10,830 kilometers in diameter, and covered in deserts, fields, and rainforests. And to understand their biology, we actually have to look at their history first, as they are an evolutionary offshoot of the Duros. Just don't say that to their face. Around 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, a colony of Duros were established on Neimodia under their great leader Chal Kahan. The leader and his followers were essentially forced off-world, though the details of why this happened are unknown.
So this is like a, this is a captive population. So you have a population of people that's from a subpopulation of another culture. So they're going to have aspects of that culture, but also of that specific culture if they're not mixed. So this is why you have things like Puritan culture in the US. And then when that small subculture then expands and they're in a new place, so their culture shifts over time, you then create something new and it can get out of control very, very quickly, which is basically the United States' origin story. But yeah, let's hear about it. What happens when these guys go to a new environment, followers of a specific person with specific ideas about how to do things.
Perhaps political violence or a religious cult. We just get the vague fall from grace in Duros culture. And in his later years, Chalal wrote the Encyclical of Historical Greatness, which pushed his fellow Neimodian colonists to try to embrace and maintain their old Duros heritage. Though the language Pak is believed to be derived from Durese, it rapidly diverged to become a distinct language, with Pak referring to not just the musical quality of their guttural croaks, but also the subtle hand movements and body language that added meanings to words.
Vikak nakamak. Nebaga imana. Naki naya. Bila maknam unya kamna lebek.
Which all made it a very difficult language for any alien race to pick up, and is why we almost always see them speaking Galactic Basic. Over several generations, the effects of the much greater gravitational force on Neimodia was having obvious
I'll put Mandalorians
effects.
up
You can
next.
see the ancestry in their nose down to their chin, and their red eyes with that line through them, but the cranium shape becomes more rounded, with thicker, more protruding bones, while the change in skin color is likely more due to changes in the atmosphere and diets. Specifically the dimmer star, and frequent fog and mist that would have often cloaked this colony world. The weirdness of the biology starts with the fact that the females show signs of once having given birth via eggs, but they all give live birth to grubs. These would live in communal hives until the age of 7. All the parents left their grubs in these state-run facilities seemingly without further contact, where they were intentionally given inadequate amounts of food, with the purpose of breeding generations that were increasingly treacherous, as the grubs would either
Dude, see, that's crazy. Like, they just have generations and they're just like, they're just controlling for a certain characteristic and they're farming their own people into what they want. Like the video, please. I would appreciate it. If you like the content, honestly, if you don't like it, dislike it. I would kind of know whether it's good.
forcibly take or
up or
find
down,
clever
please.
ways to steal and store their food in order to survive. Perhaps due to the intense requirements of those original settlers who built a civilization from nothing on a far-off alien world.
Neimodians
They felt
have
this
bad
system produced the
physiognomy.
kind of adults
They
needed
really
to
do.
survive in this harsh galaxy. But it isn't like this produced a fierce warrior people like the Mandalorians, who wanted only the powerful to rule and believed might made right. Instead, the Neimodians were the worst of both worlds. They were willing to kill anyone who stood in their way, but would do it through backstabbing, and being traumatized by their upbringing, almost all of them were fearful and greedy, with weak minds and a fetish for centralized power and absolute authority held in their leaders.
Could not entirely let go of their natural tendency towards subterfuge.
They could not entirely let go of their natural tendency towards subterfuge.
They sought duplicity and guile, the way a young grub seeks the safety and warmth of its sleeping niche in the communal hive.
Many Coruscanti researchers point out how the original vision of the droid army being controlled by a central command was such an obvious design structure for the Neimodians that they didn't even consider its weakness if that head was cut off. The top-down control of the droid army was an
Dude, I love that point. I love that point. They're just like, oh, they created, like, their cultural creation of an army is a droid army, because they're also essentially like this big hive mind kind of thing. They're this crazy bureaucracy, which honestly, the bureaucracy and the respect to like everything, it kind of makes me it kind of makes me think of the Chinese in a certain way. But kind of any culture that we compare them to, it's going to be a negative thing, right?
even consider its weakness if that head was cut off. The top-down control of the droid army was an extension of their culture. By 22,000 BBY, they joined the Republic. And while the galactic government tried to crack down on some abusive practices, like fighting the Zygerians and trying to end slavery, it is unlikely other senators really knew what was going on in Neimodian space. Almost all of them tried to repress their memories of their homeworld and upbringing, rising up in the companies that were the precursors to the Trade Federation, being one of the most active people during the expansionist period of the Old Republic era, where the most conniving of them led the movements to colonize dozens of nearby planets. The most lucrative were called purse worlds, and these would also serve as the administrative HQs of the fractured corpo states that led the expansion. The most notable purse worlds being Cato Neimodia, Deco Neimodia, and Koru Neimodia. You can see they got a thing for branding and making sure everybody knew they were from the rejected colonists of Neimodia, not Duros, a distinction their evolutionary cousins were happy to help with. While Neimodians had a chip on their shoulder trying to prove their distinct society, the Duros were tired of being conflated with the cowardly, lazy, greedy people. Just looking at that cowardly part alone, there was a saying that Neimodians were the only species with an organ dedicated to worrying, which was really just a quirk in their lung pods, that when they were stressed, the lung...
So just like this is the thing that happens. People will have the biggest issue with people. What is up, Frenchie? How are you doing? How is Australia? People will like they'll have issues more with the people that are so close to them but not quite them, because there's an issue of like, you know, Haiti and the Dominican Republic and like US and Canada as a rivalry, not like a real thing. But this is where people have conflict, is where you're almost but you're not, because if you're very different, it, you know, sometimes not a big deal.
Lungs grew in size and convulsed in a strange pattern that made it look like a series of separate organs firing under the skin. Stress could also cause this mottled look in their skin, though some would get this look simply from overeating, and they were known to turn a bright pink when nauseated, while doctors often joked that the, quote, principal export of the Neimodian home planet is brainworm rot type C. This disease was just one of thousands that were known to be found breeding in these skin folds, and is why many looked at them as a kind of dirty rat species, because since the time of the Old Republic, they were uniquely
they're actually carrying diseases.
Notorious disease carriers. And Coruscant even had to forbid travelers from Neimodia and quarantine their homeworld altogether from galactic trade and travel on several different occasions, something I've not seen for any other planet in the galaxy. There has never been a direct answer for why the case of disease and parasites is so high with them, but some point to their farming. Most of the income on these purse worlds came from their rather ingenious system of fungus farms. Clever in how nothing went to waste, and that it was a self-perpetuating method where the insect hives, beetle hatcheries, and fungus all fed into each other, creating a perfectly cultivated circle of life. Or as its owners saw it, an infinite money cheat code, which produced food, medicine, and chemical compounds that they essentially had a monopoly on. They openly bragged about how efficient the system was in distributing their population as well, as the smarter ones rose to manage farms, then entire continents and planets, while the dumb Neimodians worked the actual facilities to make sure the fungus and insectoid livestock were cared for and processed, with increasingly dumber Neimodians working on the lower-ranking worlds, with jewels like Cato Neimodia having the best of the worst lower classes, while their home world Neimodia was considered a hell world, for those grubs who barely escaped starvation in those first 7 years of life, whose IQ was so low and their guile so absent that their superiors were surprised they were smart enough to breed. Those worst of the worst worked in the foggy fungal farms. Everyone else wanted to get out of their homeworld as quickly as possible, never returning and seeing it as a torturous prison. And I think this is the best explanation for their uniquely bad hygiene, as their leadership got a kick out of making an example of the workers on Neimoidia, publicly explaining that they feed them less even in adulthood in order to keep their willpower low and function just at maintenance to tend the fungus, but never get any creative ideas like rebellion or a labor strike.
Sounds
And
like our
most
society,
off-world
right?
Neimoidians
Okay.
agreed that this was apt
pretty on the
punishment
nose,
for being
but-
so weak since the time of the grub hive. While in the back of their minds, they knew that if you failed in business and dropped in social status, you might fall all the way down into these pits of the brainworm-infested hell, which
Ugh.
only helped to keep those off-world both vicious and in constant fear, which
Come
addled
on,
everything from their nerves to skin. 4800 BBY saw them expanding into drug dealing, specifically from other species' native medicines, buying up rights to become the exclusive providers of Rill, the spice from Ryloth that was so potent and addictive that it would later attract the Hutts. And with
Nope,
Neimoidian
not cool,
distribution,
man.
whole new epidemics were spread, this time not from the petri dish that was their body, but several species were experiencing mass addictions and death rates only seen in a time of war. Gank were a species famous for their high-tech arms and armor that allowed them to be a go-to people for large bounty hunting
So
missions.
this
and
is something that's happened in the human culture a lot. Like somebody will not have as many defenses against something. Something is added into their culture that it doesn't make sense in their culture. And then you see generations of alcoholism, for example, is a bigger problem amongst Native American communities than others.
and private military contracts. Neimoidians hired them to put down what felt like a
Yeah,
zombie apocalypse
seriously.
when the porporate
extreme.
species became mindlessly homicidal when exposed to real spice. The Neimoidians gave orders to protect their
this is why
spice
I'm doing
facilities
this.
at all costs, but the Gank mercs were proactive and not waiting for the next wave.
How do you guys feel about this type of video? I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to gauge. It's somewhat interesting, but it feels like I'm not saying enough. Like I'm not giving enough value with what I'm doing on this particular one.
Of zombies to attack
Let me know
them,
what you
but went
think.
out and
Like
systematically
the video
slaughtered
or
the entire native
thumbs up or
population,
thumbs down. Let me
leading
know
to the
on
extinction of the porporites. And it was around this time that the surplus of
Better at
credits
that.
from drug dealing went into fabulous clothing, described as an obsession intended to make others jealous, with symbolic meaning and status symbols packed into every level, from color to the combo and style of robe, cloak, collars, and hats, to the point that many joke that you would never see one without a hat. And the Republic's Xenosociological database has entire guides to decode the meaning of a Neimoidian's look. And the importance of fashion was so universally recognized that a disgraced and demoted one would
Oh
be
my
immediately
god! I read the muted now, but yeah, whatever. I got to get better at this. I'll get more used to it. I forget what I said. I got like an encyclopedia of like Native American cultures over there. Whatever, man. Yeah, thanks, guys. It's all coming in. I'm muted. All right.
stripped of their clothes in public at the moment of offense. With expansion and wealth came an ever-increasing problem of piracy. From 1000 to the 400s BBY, the Neimoidians were coming to dominate galactic trade, and formed one of the largest navies to protect it. As protection scaled up from the blaster on your hip, to laser cannons on your transport, then starfighters to escort them, and before you knew it, military-grade weaponry was commonplace in an era where the Republic had no standing military of its own. In 1000 BBY, the Jedi believed they had destroyed the Sith. The greatest threat to peace was finally removed. So it was actually Finis Valorum's old descendant, Tarsus, that signed the Ruusan Reformations, that reduced the Great Republic military to a police force focused on Coruscant, and let the Jedi get back to being esoteric monks, leaving the rest of the galaxy to look out for itself. There are countless systems who look to the Neimoidian-run businesses as the lifeline for their community, providing all the employment opportunities and protection from pirates. This is why in 350 BBY, the Trade Federation was formed, with the Republic's blessing, granting them unique charters and trying to do what it could to incentivize economic growth in the expansion regions, and allow these corporations to.
But if you're not the one providing safety, whoever has the monopoly on violence, whoever has the right to collect taxes, those are basically the only things that have to do with who controls the civilization. Who can do violence in a place is who controls it, essentially. And it's the cops. If that's who it is, it's the cops. The cops are allowed to do violence. They're allowed to restrict your liberty and everything for their decided on societal rules.
to defend themselves. Despite their cowardly reputation as a species, their warriors were respected, and their special forces were feared throughout the galaxy. While there was not anything the size of the CIS or Grand Army of the Republic, there were still a ton of violent pirate groups and private militaries, so the Neimodian Royal Guard should be considered top tier. Called Royal for their service to what was being called the Trade Monarch, one who was head of the Neimodian Inner Circle. This monarch would coordinate with the senator and was on the board of the Trade Federation, and was often elected to be the commanding viceroy. So there were times where the monarch would rule Neimodian space and wield power in the larger corporate federation, which came to include the most powerful manufacturers, even Republic juggernauts like Kuat Drive Yards. In fact, splitting off enough of these companies would be crucial to building an army for the Clone Wars, which required Darth Sidious to get involved in a master plot that is better explained in these videos, and help to create the tensions needed to spark the Clone Wars, as well as creating the corporate sector and other zones we see in Andor. Quickest way to summarize it is that the Trade Federation became so powerful that they got a Senate seat, and the Republic wanted to expand hyperlanes and modernize as much of the galaxy as possible, so these companies had all the leverage. And with the cutthroat, greedy Neimodian leadership at the helm, it wasn't long before countless star systems became totally dependent on the Trade Federation, with the board of directors being the true governing body throughout these free trade zones. When the massacre at the Ariadu conference...
I don't know what you expected. You don't control the territory if you don't control the military there. And I guess you can control the thing that actually has the military there, but the Republic eventually couldn't do that. And they allowed it to change over time.
The non-Neimodian members, Nute Gunray was in control of the Trade Federation Directorate, and valuable member worlds like Kuat withdrew. Sidious predicted the next step, that Valorum would push for a taxation of the free trade zones and attempt to break up Trade Federation power, forcing all those affected to become even closer allies, aligning the interests of the intergalactic banking clan.
So you align the interests of your enemies, you shouldn't do that. It's why I criticized not that I do geopolitics a lot, but I criticized pushing Russia towards China. Russia and China have a long border. They have historical tensions. They're not natural friends. And putting them and making their trade relationship closer is not good for NATO. Not that I care. I mean, I guess I care because I live in the US, but I'm not like pro NATO in a sense. I digress.
Corporate alliance and techno union against the Republic. The Trade Federation had recently created a new line of defense droids to protect their ships and facilities, working with the Geonosians of Bactoid Armor Workshops to create the B-1, a design that was said to mirror both the Geonosian frame, but also resembled what a dead Neimodian looked like. When they died, their bodies rapidly dried up, leaving this big oval head on a thin skeletal frame. And then there were the massive trade haulers like the Lucre Hulk that had been ever increasing in firepower for years, with the addition of Vulture droid starfighters to protect against the greatest piracy of this era, even with a ground force to protect on-world facilities, protecting them from hostile locals that were either spiced out of their minds or forming another violent Union resistance. The Trade Federation military was legal, but their next move was debatable.
Begin landing your troops.
My lord, is that legal?
I will make it legal.
Even the blockade was legal.
As you know, our blockade is perfectly legal.
But it was the invasion of Theed and forcing the Queen to sign a treaty at the barrel of a blaster that was a step too far.
How will you explain this invasion to the Senate?
The Queen and I will sign a treaty that will legitimize our occupation here.
Due to their previous trade agreements, Naboo could be blockaded on a claim of payments owed, and the hope was that by the time the Senate ever resolved this issue, the Queen would have already been forced to sign her world away. This, of course, didn't go to plan. And the next 10 years were spent with Nute Gunray still as the sole ruler of a humiliated and jaded trade federation, and his secret Sith ally was head of the Republic. In these years, the corporations that would all come to form the Confederacy of Independent Systems were being guided by Count Dooku. When a particularly important party was interrupted by Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Clone Wars was ignited here on Geonosis, with the combined Corpo private militaries engaging the Republic's secret clone army. The war was hard on all Neimodians. Even those loyal to the Republic were met with heavy skepticism and sometimes violence, often seen as CIS spies. It didn't help that Nute Gunray was hitting all those old stereotypes, and were seen as the most important element in the Confederacy. Though we see the greatest examples of Neimodian warriors of this time as well, with the Gunnery Battalion, drawing on ancient designs of their Beetle Knight armor, utilizing powerful blaster pistols, developing specialized units like snipers, and genetically modified giants dubbed the Neimodian Brutes. The banking clan would often get in feuds with these traitors, and would end up being a major victor in the Clone Wars, while the Neimodian leadership was killed on Mustafar, having fulfilled their purpose of 30 plus years of planning with Sidious and his old master Darth Plagueis.
Lord Sidious promised us peace.
In a comical reversal of the plan on Naboo, the acting viceroy Centipeth Findos was forced to sign a treaty giving over all rights of the Trade Federation over to the new emperor, making Palpatine the legal head of the Federation overnight. And the first thing to get liquidated under this new management were several major grub hatcheries. Not to be outdone by Anakin's little kill streak, Sidious quickly took out millions of these grub children. Shortly after this, a refuge colony escaped out into the unknown regions and was discovered by the Chiss Mithril.
That's like a trillion genocide thing. That's insane.
Narodu. There was a desperate plea for the Chiss to help the Neimodians take back the galaxy and knock the Emperor off his throne, but this was rejected by the Chiss ascendancy.
But during one of my surveys, I discovered a colony of refugee Neimodians. Once they learned who I represented, they pleaded with me to bring the Chiss to battle against Coruscant. They promised their people would rise up in response, and that together we would bring down Emperor Palpatine and restore the Republic.
It was in this time that the book mentioned before, the encyclical on historical greatness, was written, detailing their history on how they parted from the Duros 25,000 years earlier, and it was written with the purpose of convincing his people to give up this animosity for their ancestors. Because in the Imperial era, everyone hated the Neimodians. Obviously, the human-centric imps, the common people saw them as primarily responsible for the Clone Wars, and even smart rebels realized that the insatiable greed was a primary tool of Darth Sidious. Shao Kahn wanted them to try and be seen as Duros, since nobody really hated them. And while their blue brothers did everything they could to deny this at first, it is said that by the time of the New Republic, these species got along pretty well, and Neimodian-run businesses seemed to merge with the Duros, without any major incidents or backstabbing greedy behavior. So just 2 years after Endor, in 6 ABY, there was another series of major outbreaks that did stem from Neimodians, with the Great Pandemic of Dur Sheba in the intestinal ravage of Bars Barca. As Naboo merchant Boabab wrote about it, quote, "Of course, it should be mentioned here that the Neimodians are notorious virus carriers."
Wait, so they all did, so they did the diversity thing and they integrated and then it actually killed a bunch of people? Is that what's happening like in Star Wars lore? Are like are the liberals aware of this? Like what?
Though immune to most harmful microbes themselves, they have been a scourge of the galaxy, responsible, although they deny it, for the Great Pandemic of Dur Sheba and the equally lethal intestinal ravages of Bars Barca that created the massive weight loss that swept through the Abyss colonists. So that's it for the breakdown. As for behind-the-scenes facts, originally they were to be shown in CGI and meant to.
We're going to hop over to the Mandalorian now. That's what JC requested. So let's go. Mandalorians.
Weapons. We're not huddled in one place. We span the galaxy. We need no lords or leaders, so you cannot destroy our command. We can live without technology, so we can fight with our bare hands. We have no species or bloodline, so we can rebuild our ranks with others.
Okay, so we can live without technology, so we can fight with our bare hands. So you're able to be there in any situation. Very Imperial Japanese-esque. We have no species or bloodline, so it's just an ideology. So it's a very powerful ideology. So we can rebuild our ranks with others who want to join us. And then you select for people that actually just are down with your whole thing. And they're fully committed because it's a crazy commitment, but I guess they can get people to do it.
Others who want to join us. We're more than just a people or an army, our AT. We're a culture. We're an idea. And you can't kill ideas, but we can certainly kill you. What's up, meta-nerds? This is essentially a documentary on the Mandalorians, or as they're called in their own language, the Manduade, meaning the children of Mandalore. Like that quote mentions, the Mandalorians aren't a species, but a culture. We'll get into their origins, their history, how they did start as a specific species, but ended up being mostly humans, notable Mandoade across history, and their constant and important role as a third-party wildcard in galactic affairs. Our story starts around 24,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, when the Tong species were entrenched in a war of elimination against the Zell. These Zell are the human natives to Coruscant. They had been fighting the Tong for centuries. When a volcano erupted and leveled the humans' capital, the Tong saw a chance at victory, launching intense raids over the next 2 years, as Coruscant was plunged into total darkness, the atmosphere full of volcanic ash. The Tong's terrifying raids would be immortalized in a poem that is still known throughout the galaxy, called the Weda Verde, the Warriors of Shadow. The Tong's whole culture revolved around war, with the society being loosely assembled warrior clans that all followed their chieftains. They would give their children names like Atkin, Kot, and Tor, meaning persistent, strength, and justice.
A lot of naming styles are a thing. I should talk about naming styles. Different cultures, different levels of a culture. So like band level, tribe level, that type of thing. They'll name their children different things, but you can often, like, there's common threads between them.
While their gods reflected this warlike nature as well. Kod Harengir was a god who used conflict to improve the world. Survival of the fittest both in your own behaviors, your family, but also in the world around you. The idea that competition was a way to accelerate natural selection, and thus war is applied on a massive scale, eventually a galactic scale. Note that in this,
it's like this when there's an incentive in the culture that like men have to go to war to prove themselves, or in this case, men and women have to go to war to prove themselves, then you're then promoting a culture that wants to go to war and in fact has to go to war because when young ambitious men, they know they have to prove themselves. Today you might go and be an investment banker, but back then you're an aristocrat. You go become a military officer and you fight and you get honor, and you maybe, and this is true even in more modern times, you maybe put yourself in a situation to maybe be a hero and volunteer some of your own men as an officer for death for the advancement of your career. I've seen it.
There is no concept of morality as we would conceive of it on Earth. With them, surviving is equated with
all about what you incentivize.
And that process is a good in of itself. Conquering in this culture has the equivalence of happiness or well-being in most Earth cultures, things that philosophically and religiously are usually considered to be goods in themselves. We don't ask why someone would prefer to be happy. Likewise, the Tong would have not understood why they had to explain why combat was preferable to peace. And further to this point,
Eternal
the opposing
truth.
god in their duality is not a devil that corrupts or wants to spread misery. The Tong god that needs to be resisted was Arasum, a sloth god who tempted those to live a life of stagnation and idleness. If the Sith mantra reads, "Peace is a lie," you could think of these early Mandalorians as believing that peace is a sin. This was enshrined in a body of text called the Canons of Honor, which had within it the Resolnare, meaning the 6 actions, as well as commentaries from wise Tong chieftains. A notable quote reads,
I adhere to the Resolnare, the core of what it means to be Mandalorian, the sacred law giving us direction and purpose. Education and armor, self-defense, our tribe, our language, our leader, all help us survive. We must educate our children as Mandalorians, obey the command.
And I mean, this is saying that they have to be acculturated, which is a term, acculturated, ACCULTURA. I'm not going to spell the whole word. I kind of lost my place. Acculturated means as you are taught the rules of your culture as you grow up in age. There's another term for like adoption into a new culture, assimilation. I mean, that's a common one.
Commands of Mandalore, speak Mandoa, and defend our clans.
Here's where the Mandalorian armor was enshrined as something to keep holy, and forever tied to being one of the Mandoade, symbolizing the keeping of these virtues. The Tong armor had this metal helmet that was form-fitting upon their triangular heads, and you can see how this early armor that accommodated the room for the eyes and their pointed jaws remained a look in the helmets even as it changed over tens of thousands of years. But despite this warring culture, the original human Coruscanti simply outnumbered the Shadow Warriors. They were eventually able to push the Tong off their homeworld. At this point, there is a split, where a peace-loving sect of priestly female Tong fled Coruscant for the unknown regions. But the majority of them went to the planet Rune in the Outer Rim. This was the darkest moment in the history of Mandalorian culture, literally due to the so-called Cloak of the Sith, a thick layer of cosmic dust that shrouded this planet, but also because they would stay here wallowing in obscurity and weakness for about 17,000 years.
It's a long
The year
time, bro.
7000 BBY would see the rise of Te Solek Mandalore, or Mandalore the first to use the title Sole Ruler, translated to Mandalore. He would become the chief of all chieftains and formed the Mandalorian Crusaders, a force that spread out, conquering world after world in the Outer Rim. They eventually came across a planet in Sector 07 that had plenty of fresh water and farmable land, but also an incredibly unique material called Beskar. This form of iron ore contained elements that could withstand multiple blows from lightsabers. and yet was malleable enough to be crafted into armor. It seemed the war god had blessed their return to conquering, with this perfect world to become the capital of the Mandalore Empire, and it was thus named Mandalore. The only problem was the native population. The mythosaurs were enormous beasts that ruled this world. Creatures that would scare away most other settlers were instead seen by the Mandalorians as proof that this world was reserved for the ultimate warriors. Mandalore I and his crusaders extincted the mythosaur and left their bones out in the open for all to see how large
extinct as a extincted? Is that what he said?
Extincted the mythosaur
Yeah, he
and
extincted
left their
them.
bones out in
Good
the
one.
open for all to see how large and
love
numerous their foes were. The creature's skull would become synonymous with the strength of the Mandalorians, and would become one of the most well-known and respected sigils across the galaxy for thousands of years to come. Over the next 3,000 years, they consolidated their new territory in the Outer Rim, spreading out from Mandalore to capture nearby Ordo, Gargon, and Shogun, while also developing Mandalore's moon, Concordia. But during this time, they were undergoing a sort of religious revolution over these thousands of years of fighting. It came about that the Mandalores saw the old god Cad Harangir as not a true and separate entity that needed to be worshipped with special rites developed for him. This was in a way a form of idolatry, worshipping a construct instead of the act of war itself. It wasn't this god, but the whole universe that was created and developed by the act of dominating. The microscopic organism, with a slight advantage over its competitors, devours them. The forming of planets is a process of absorbing your neighboring space debris to make yourself larger. The black hole devours light itself, and yet still can be swallowed up by a larger black hole. The powerful conquering is a law of the universe. Therefore, the rituals to
That's one
Cad
way to put it,
Harangir
man.
were a distraction from this universal presence, the sort of will that is present everywhere and in all things. And so they realized that anyone who wages war itself was in tune with this divine plan, that combat was the one and only true form of worship. Not to some old god, but you personally were carrying out the divine will, and thus in that moment, you yourself are divine. Not only is this more sophisticated metaphysics, but it's a great way to rally up some more crusaders. With this mindset, they would carry on fighting and
Okay, so the belief of their religion is like internally intertwined with fighting. So you just want to keep fighting, and that's how you reach God. That's pretty dope, I guess.
over. But interestingly, this is where we also see a non-Tong species brought into the Mandalorian fold. The first ever non-Tong Mandos were the Mandalorian giants. They were able to repel the Mandalorians, but loved the warrior culture so much that they adopted their culture. We're now in the year 4000 BBY, where the Crusaders were busy extincting the Navuta species. But they did absorb many Escaloni slaves, but also destroyed the noble basilisk. These were highly intelligent dragon-like species, and this conflict would be the first time that Mandalorians faced off against Jedi. The Order sent over some relief, but even this combined force could not stand up to the Crusaders. The basilisks poisoned their own world to deny it to the conquerors, but some were taken as slaves, while their machines, the basilisk war droids, were captured and would become a staple of the Crusader military. From here, they launched an attack into the deep core, into the unstable Empress Teta system. They conquered a few worlds, which got the attention of Jedi Knight turned Sith warlord Ulic Qel-Droma. Mandalore the Indomitable challenged him to a duel, where despite his war droid and Beskar armor, he was defeated and swore allegiance to Qel-Droma and his Sith master Exar Kun. This marked the first Mandalorian-Sith alliance. This was during an event called the First Sith War, also known as the Great Shadow Crusade to the Mandalorian people, which was fought in a single year, 3996 BBY. This new alliance launched a daring raid on the Republic shipyards over Forost. Here they attained as much as 300 starships. With this flotilla, they went directly to the Republic's capital, attacking the home of the original Mandalorians, Coruscant. They poured into Galactic City, but were betrayed by their allies, the Krath witch Alimo Keto. She also abandoned Qel-Dromo to the Jedi forces. Mandalore the Indomitable was able to escape and made it to Exar Kun on Yavin 4. Explaining the situation, the pair teamed up and personally raided the Senate building and rescued Droma. The witch was dispatched by the trio, and they decided to abandon Coruscant for now. Later attacks brought the Basilisk war droids up against the Beast Riders and Drexels on Onderon, as they attempted to take the capital city of Isis. Onderon's moon, Daxon, has an orbit that places the two temporarily in each other's atmosphere, which allowed the Indomitable to flee when the Republic forces responded to invasion. His mount was shot down, and he plummeted into the thick jungle of this moon. Here, a swarm of beasts devoured the Indomitable. He had led the Mandalorians for so long that his distinct helmet became a symbol of the sole ruler. Without a Mandalore, many of the clans started to fracture, but the helmet was discovered by a Tong who had lived through that battle. He removed it and declared himself Mandalore the Ultimate. He realized that his people had been dragged into the witch's machinations, and vowed to restore the Mandalorians to the great warrior status they once held. On the planet Shogun, which years earlier had shown the Indomitable that the old gods were false, now gave Mandalore the Ultimate a vision of the Tong species going extinct. At this time, the Tong species made up the bulk of Mandalorians, and it was them that kept hurling themselves at the Republic and the Jedi. But he knew that the Mandalorian values were not bound to the Tong species, and so he formed the Neo-Crusaders. He traveled the galaxy giving rousing speeches to those willing to embrace the martial principles. Humans were the most populous and widespread species in the galaxy, and this is why the majority of these new Mandalorians were human. But there were also tons of Rhodians, Twi'leks, Togorians, and Corestians. From this moment on, the term Mandalorian really started to become untied to the Tong species. Now it was more about the culture. About 20 years after the previous war, now
probably like some Tong racists who were like, this is bullshit. We got these humans coming in taking our jobs.
3,978 BBY, a pureblood Sith species contacted Mandalore the Ultimate and enticed him to search Sith ruins for insight into the future. This Sith was working for the mysterious Sith Emperor and used his powers in the Force to instill visions of Mandalorians conquering the Republic. Inspired by promises of victory, the Neo-Crusaders started to capture neutral territory, and in 10 years they controlled a larger area than all of the Hutt clans. The Ultimate appointed a man named Cassus Fett to be the top military strategist, and he promptly accelerated the capture of more worlds. One of Fett's contributions was the standardization of armor, something that helped to create a more cohesive identity across the diverse species.
Okay, so this is what's going to happen when the culture changes to the point where it's defining characteristics. Characteristic is not a particular species, but it's also like in material terms expanded into new planets, which has implications for communication, implications of vastly new environments and separation from a central hub. And that's gonna change, and there's gonna be characteristics of the people that you pull in, and that's gonna require brand new things that are created out of the old, but also with new influences.
And ensured that the galaxy at large knew when they were dealing with a Mandalorian. He also developed a dual-pronged economic assault, in which these captured neutral worlds deprived the Republic of imports, while the Mandalorians took the local population as slave labor, and focused all of these planets' resources to the sole task of creating more weapons and ships for the eventual war with the Republic. This caused an inpouring of refugees that caused internal strife and economic pressures.
They're like a whole culture that's just built around taking over more land and more weapons, and then doing more war. It's almost like there's another culture like that.
Compounding the weakness of losing these neutral worlds. Senators said that the Republic would only intervene if directly attacked. And all this time, the Ultimate had set up training grounds deep in the jungle of Daxon. The place where his predecessor had been devoured, these camps were one of the greatest embodiments of their culture. Training against the very creatures that had felled their leader, lifting up the rank and file to a greater strength than the best among them from just a generation before.
The group of men going out.
In 3964, they sprang up from the secret camp and took Onderon, Vanquo, and Taurus in a shocking blitzkrieg. Two Jedi named Revan and Malak became aware of some of the Mandalorian atrocities, some of which included the nuclear bombardments of entire worlds. These two Jedi refused to stand by, eventually leading Republic forces and pushing the Mandalorians back. He came across the helmet of a Mandalorian woman who opposed Fett's genocide, and upon donning it, he swore that he would not rest until the Mandalorians had been completely defeated. Revan's strategy worked to pull most of the Mandalorian forces to Malachor 5. Here, the Jedi leader had to draw on this world's immense dark side energy in order to defeat Mandalore the Ultimate in a duel. After this, he activated the Mass Shadow Generator, which destroyed most of the Mandalorian fleets. Without their leader or a proper navy, they signed a peace treaty with the Republic. Malak worried about a rise of the Mandalorians, but Revan said simply, "Without the mask, they are nothing." A cold statement where he is acknowledging that he is destroying an entire culture simply by holding on to this mask, depriving them of a leader, which will just lead to fracturing and infighting that will eventually erase the Mandalorian.
Yeah, so the leadership is, if the leadership is based on control of a certain thing, and then an outside force has that certain thing, you're kind of screwed unless you want to change the way that leadership functions, or if it's some sort of spiritual element that can be easily agreed upon with something else. But the problem is it can't. And this is metaphorical, but there's situations like this where there is a dispute that cannot be fixed. And there's usually underlying reasons for it, underlying other beliefs between the groups of people arguing over whatever type of legitimacy they're looking for.
Identity from history. The Republic destroyed most of their military infrastructure and completely eliminated the iconic Basilisk war droids. This once proud people tried to keep up their traditions, but were spread out across the galaxy, and often resorted to taking up odd jobs as hired guns. These informal groupings became known as the Mandalorian Mercs, with notable individuals like Gore Spendak achieving gladiatorial fame on Taurus and Geonosis, and Canderous Ordo becoming one of the most infamous mercs in the galaxy. But as the Force would have it, he crossed paths with Revan, who now understood that the Mandalorians were being manipulated into war by the hidden Sith Emperor. Revan gave the helmet to Ordo and asked him to rebuild the Mandalorians
Why would you
into
need
a
to
proud
manipulate them
people.
into war?
He took the name Mandalore the Preserver. He met with what may have been the final remaining Tong in the galaxy. This being was dying, but explained that he was the rightful heir to Mandalore the Indomitable, that the Ultimate had used his Sith backing to take over. He begged that Ordo take his armor and reinstill some of the virtues from the canons of honor. Ordo would be the first non-Tong Mandalore, and he went back to their roots.
Whether or not a story like this is true, and usually there are true stories that even if they're true stories, they turn into myth in another sense of the word myth, in the sense that they are stories that that lead a culture to act a certain way, or they produce some air of legitimacy. So the idea that like this type of story is the type of story that's going to like lead a culture. It's always through metaphor. It always happens. Got to do some stuff. This is giving me some good ideas. I gotta write down.
Growing a new following of Neo-Crusaders on the outpost of Daxon. These forces would go on to fight against the Sith Triumvirate, help the Onderon royal family, and even provide aid to the Republic. Mandalore the Preserver personally aided the raid on Darth Nihilus' flagship, even providing the explosives that were used to blow it into space dust. The next 300 years of Mandalorian history is a bit foggy, but it is clear that Clan Ordo did not fully unify the Mandalorians. In 3661 BBY, the Sith Empire made a surprise return to the galaxy, and looked for another Mandalorian puppet. In the gladiator pits of Geonosis, there was a crowd favorite. It was the perfect combination of charismatic and dumb, so Imperial intelligence agents had the fights fixed, and had plants in the crowd that started chanting Mandalore upon each of his victories. This man seemed invincible, and many of the diaspora were happy to call him their new leader. The Sith revealed themselves as allies, and convinced him that it was in Mandalore's interest to blockade the Hydean Way, cutting off a major Republic supply line as the Empire expanded in the Outer Rim. Mandalorian cruisers were too powerful for a straight-up attack, so the Republic had to rely on blockade-breaking smugglers. To rally up his supporters, this puppet Mandalore announced the Great Hunt on Daxon to determine who would become his best warrior. Artus kept winning the trials, and in line with the old true virtues, challenged Mandalore to a duel in the gladiator pits on Geonosis. This propped-up leader was slaughtered, and Artus took the name Mandalore the Vindicated. His predecessor is only known in the history books as an insult, Mandalore the Lesser. He was much more cautious of his Sith allies, but knew that the money and weapons allowed him to consolidate power. But again, not all respected the centralized leader, and splinter groups like Clan Varad and the Terror Brigade launched attacks against both the Sith and the Republic. The Vindicated would be eliminated during the rise of the Eternal Empire, being killed by a swarm of Sky Troopers. Death by droid was seen as immensely dishonorable, and this whole conflict created a strong anti-droid sentiment that would stick in Mandalorian culture from here on out. Como Fett could have chosen to take on the mantle, but he didn't want the responsibility, so instead the infamous bounty hunter Shae Vizsla became Mandalore the Avenger. Previously, she had been allied to Darth Malgus, and assisted him in battles on Alderaan, and even against the Jedi Temple itself. Now she would join the Outlander and the Alliance, a combination of Sith and Republic forces that realized how grievous a threat the organic-hating Gemini droids posed to the galaxy. After this ancient, eternal force was destroyed, there was relative peace for the next 1,000+ years. That is, until the new Sith Wars, spanning from 2000 BBY to 1000. This conflict had the Mandalorians fighting against their once allies, the Sith Empire. The reasons behind this are still shrouded in mystery, but everything points to the exchange of a lot of credits, supporting a constant complaint by Mandalorians of this era that their once righteous, holy crusades of violence in accordance with the laws of the universe had been forgotten. Now it was all just for treasure. Around this time is where we also get Mandalorian training master Chang raising a Jedi named Dirge.
What's the difference?
He adopted this odd creature and raised it in the ways of the Mandalorians, but eventually he abandoned the culture when he felt that they were merely hired guns. The pair were taken in by a cyberneticist who enhanced their strength and longevity in exchange for protection from the current Mandalore. During a raid on the lab, all were killed but Dirge, who was able to massacre the attackers and devoted his life to killing Mandalorians. Darth Bane would bring an end to the Sith Empire in the year 1000 BBY, and apparently in order to ensure galactic peace, the Republic turned on the Mandalorians in 738 BBY. As the warlords were still not fully under the control of the Mandalore, the Republic invaded Mandalore itself. Infighting against rival clans allowed the Republic a total victory, with weapons used by both the Republic and the Mandalorians creating an...
You know, this is still a fallout because they spread out, right? They spread out all over everywhere, and sometimes those differences become so severe that you can't really move them together. And it's like a practicality thing. Even if there's a lot of interest in coming back together into one group, you then have to have things that you agree on. And if you've shifted to the point, and it can happen very quickly, North and South Korea, it's very unlikely based on their ways of life and cultures shifting so much that they'll be able to be under one country again. It's just difficult to do. It's very difficult to do, especially when they diverge more. And they're going to diverge more if the differences in environment change more. So, for example, with North and South Korea, different government forms, if they had stayed with a similar government, then yes, but they had diametrically opposed governments. So that affected the culture.
Enormous cataclysm,
and living
an environmental disaster that turned much of this rich world into the barren white sand deserts that now cover its surface. This is where we get the New Mandalorians, a faction with very contentious origins. Many believe that they were propped up by the Republic to coax them into abandoning their culture. The New Mandalorians said that the canons of honor only lead to death and ruin, that strength could only come by working together, by peacefully partaking in the Republic system. What I find interesting is that many Jedi were said to be leading the assault, and the Darksaber may have been stolen by the Jedi Temple around 1000 BBY. The lore on the Darksaber is not clear, simply stating that it was stolen during the fall of the Old Republic. It is said to be around a millennia before the Clone Wars, which would have been when the Republic was heavily involved in the Sith Wars. Tare Vizsla, descendant of Mandalore the Avenger Shae Vizsla, was the only Mandalorian to become a Jedi. He was able to temporarily unify his people, and so the Darksaber became the new sign of the Sole Ruler, replacing the role of the helmet. The total destruction of Mandalore is not a story the Republic would tell you, but they and the Jedi definitely played a role. It wasn't solely the result of a civil war amongst clans. But whatever you think of that, it worked, and these were now a pacifist people, devoting all of their energy to surviving in the domed cube cities. Their capital was Sundari, and the leaders came to take the names from other cultures, like King, Queen, and Duchess, no longer calling themselves the Mandalore. Those unable to give up the warrior code were sent to the moon Concordia, and the sight of armor-wearing Mandalorians became incredibly rare on Mandalore. These few called themselves the Acolyte, or Faithful, and they did keep a leader that they called Mandalore, with the last named one being a genocidal maniac named Mandalore the Destroyer. He took over after his predecessor was killed by Dirge, still carrying out murderous raids against Mandos in the year 100 BBY. Around 60 BBY, just 28 years before the Battle of Naboo, the Mandalorian Civil War erupted. Those calling themselves the true Mandalorians were living by what they called the Super Commando Codex, a sort of revised chivalry which stated that it is still noble and morally necessary to learn the martial arts, but that these skills should not be used to conquer in the old survival of the fittest framework. Instead, they are for protecting the rights of individuals. But Tor Vizsla hated this bastard child of the new pacifists and old martial ideas.
Dude, this is like
he
Western
formed a group
culture.
called Death Watch and waged war on the Super Commandos. Jaster Muriel was the leader of these true Mandalorians, and eventually he and his forces were pushed off of Mandalore to the agricultural world of Concord Dawn. The local police force had a position called the Journeyman Protector, and one of them allowed the true Mandalorian forces to hide out on his property, and so they set up camp at the Fett farm. Vizsla found out that this man was hiding Muriel and brutally interrogated him in front of the man's son. Mama Fett sprung up out of hiding and unloaded her blaster rifle into Death Watch troops. She was killed in the fighting, and his father ordered the son to run into the fields. This 8-year-old Jango Fett was picked up by Mariel, who raised the boy as his own, teaching him the new ways of the Mandalorians. The fighting between these two factions would continue, spanning nearly 2 decades, and it also saw a 14-year-old Jango Fett hold his dying adopted father in his arms, succumbing to wounds delivered by Vizsla. Jango was now considered the Mandalore, and they started to score significant victories in 44 BBY. But Vizsla and Death Watch turned to political corruption when they couldn't win on the battlefront. They contacted the governor of Galadran and concocted a story of war crimes committed by the true Mandalorian forces.
Nice.
The Jedi Order gets
Classic.
involved and believed the claims that Fett's forces were killing political activists, including innocent women and children. Count Dooku led a strike team to capture Fett, hoping to get to the bottom of these claims. But the Mandalore refused to be brought in on false claims. He knew that if he was removed for trial, Death Watch would certainly regain their strength. So Fett and the true Mandos opened fire. The shootout resulted in 11 dead Jedi, 6 of which were shot by Jango personally, but all of his forces were cut down. Fett was indeed captured and turned over to the corrupt Galadran governor, who in turn sold him into slavery. But you don't get the reputation for being a galactic badass on your looks alone. Jango was able to escape, break into the governor's office, and steal back his trophy armor, and then track down and kill Vizsla. Seeing that both the local governments and even the Jedi Order could be so easily manipulated by evil, and also being hardened by the war and life as a slave, Jango Fett dedicated his life to being a bounty hunter. And on his armor, he would proudly bear his adopted father's sigil. He never did forgive the Jedi Order, but ironically, he would become allied to the Jedi that led that strike team that forever changed his life. The Mandalorian Civil War was terrible for the individuals that directly experienced it, but it was a relatively small conflict, mostly only affecting Mandalore itself and a few of its neighboring worlds. Even the amount of those involved was a great minority of the population, which helped the pacifist movement even more. Now is when Duchess Satine comes to power, pushing a pacifist agenda even further, about 20 years before the opening of the Clone Wars. In 32 BBY, the bounty-hunting Jango was approached by Darth Tyrannus to create a clone army. It is unclear if this fallen Jedi used the promise of Order 66 to entice Jango, whether or not he knew that his clones would be used to take down his enemies in the Jedi Order. But either way, the Kaminoans brought him in not just for genetic donation, but also for hands-on training, and even the designing of these troops' armor. This is why clone troopers have a similar T-visor appearance. Fett personally trained the first batch of Alpha-class ARC troopers, instilling Mandalorian traditions, and even ensuring that they memorized the song Vodean, meaning brothers all, an ancient chant sung in the Mandoa language, and which mentions that they are the wrath of Coruscant. Gives it a nice dual meaning given how the clones were used by the Republic, and that Coruscant is the original homeworld of the Tong species. Then Jango established the Cueva Dar, a group of 100 sergeants, 75 of which were Mandalorians. Members like Cal Scarata helped to infuse Mandalorian culture even further, though Palpatine would take measures to phase out these Mandalorian-trained clones, with later batches not receiving this rich cultural tradition. Back on Mandalore, Satine vowed to keep neutral during the Clone Wars, but Death Watch sought out Dooku as an ally. They attacked a Republic cruiser, and spread rumors on Confederate worlds that the new Mandalorians were actually supporting the Republic. This is why Obi-Wan was dispatched to meet with Satine, a woman that he came to love after being assigned to protect her in the final months of the Civil War. Remember that Mandalore's moon Concordia was the exile place for all the old Mandalorians, those trying to keep up the war-loving traditions. It was governed by Pre Vizsla, who was secretly supporting the production of weapons, jetpacks, and full suits of armor, all for the purposes of overthrowing the pacifists. This sparked a really controversial move by the Republic, who after learning that Death Watch now had such growth and backing, sent a large peacekeeping force. Many Mandalorians opposed this, seeing it as occupation, and proof that the Republic still believed that the Mandalorians were too dangerous and unpredictable to rule themselves. This brought more traitors out of the shadows, like Senator Merrick, who was thought to be one of the Duchess's most trusted allies. His scheme would mark the start of several assassination attempts, while Dooku started giving more and more support to Death Watch, even offering to provide Mandalorian people with CIS droids to protect them from the unwanted Republic clones. And then it seemed like...
Alright, I'm gonna hop off. Let me know in the Discord what you think about this, what other topic streams you want to see. I'm working on longer content, but I'm learning a few things first. I realized I was working way too hard for a finished product that then like not as hard for something else, and then that gets viewed a lot, and I have to learn the platform a little bit more, and then change up the podcast format a little bit. But we'll see. But okay, yeah. Let me know in the Discord you had any questions or anything, and how you like this. All right.